I'm Kathy Brown, and I'm with the University of Illinois Extension and a member of the Community and Economic Development team. During today's webinar, we're going to be recording it, and we will make it available for review on our Extension's local government education website. During today's program, we're going to be taking a look at the 2017 federal legislative update. This program is made possible through the University of Illinois Extension, and we strive to provide equal opportunities in programs and employment. And if you should need reasonable accommodation to participate in this or any other program, please do contact your local extension office and they can make those accommodations. To ensure the best quality in our recording, microphones will be muted during the presentation. We do, however, want to encourage you to add questions in the chat space. And if you have any problems connecting, you can add those as well. And we've placed in the chat space how you can access or participate in this program by dialing in over the phone, and you can listen to the presentation that's being given. The presenter will be able to see your comments as well and may respond to those during his presentation or may take time at the end of the program to respond to questions that you may have. As a University of Illinois Extension program, it's really important that our local government education team receive feedback from you, not only for today, but also for future programs. Following today's program, an email survey will be sent to you today, and we'll ask each of you to complete the survey. And that's primarily to help us provide a good quality program going forward. And we'll be giving to you a copy of the slide decks and giving you information on how you can listen to the recording as well. Our speaker today is Jack Peterson, and he staffs the National Association of County Officials, Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Policy Steering Committee. In his work, he's also previously staffed the Human Services and Education Steering Committees and the Veterans and Military Services Committees. He has served as a legislative assistant at NACO and supported the association's management services for the National Association of County Veteran Service Officers and the National Association of Pre-Trial Service Agency. Prior to joining the National Association of County Officials, Jack was a government relations associate and worked in multiple offices on Capitol Hill. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Davidson College, just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. At this time, I want to welcome our speaker and guests and turn the program over to Jack Peterson.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and a big thank you to the University of Illinois Extension team for inviting NACO and all of our staff to be part of this webinar series. And good morning or afternoon to everyone who's joining today. I'd like to thank you all for listening in and for your interest in this topic. For those who are not familiar with the National Association of Counties, or NACO, we're the only national organization representing all 3,069 county governments, both elected officials and their staffs in Washington, D.C. In addition to our federal policy team, we also have a fairly extensive best practices shop. We publish research reports, we analyze federal data, and we operate a variety of programs that help counties and residents save money. Today, I'm going to focus on the federal policy landscape here in Washington. But before I dive too deep into that, I want to give just a quick background on NACO and our policy process and our policy stances, so that everyone has a good understanding of how we choose to focus on which issues we really choose to spend our time on. The slide in front of you shows NACO's policy development process, and it usually works from the bottom up. NACO has 10 policy steering committees covering issues from transportation to human services to economic development. As Kathy said, I staff our Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, which covers everything from all of the tax reform discussions at the end of last year to census issues to county elections and the role of counties in elections to county-tribal relations. These committees each have usually over 100 different county officials on them who debate policies important to counties at the federal level. When a policy committee approves a policy, it goes to our board of directors, who must approve it, and then it goes to our full membership for a vote on approval. All of that is to say, by the time a policy makes it into our American County platform, which we as staff use as our living document to lobby both Capitol Hill and the administration, it has been thoroughly vetted, discussed, debated, and amended. This slide in front of you now is just a quick snapshot of our 10 policy steering committees. All of us work hand in hand on many issues that cross multiple portfolios. But I did just want to give sort of a quick snapshot of the variety of different things that NACO covers. We like to say we cover domestic policy from A to Z. I know there's only A to T on this slide, but we cover all the things in domestic policy. So let's get to what is going on in Washington, and I would like to start by saying this. Each day is unique here, and we should expect the unexpected. Just this morning, negotiations over funding the government hit a couple of different speed bumps and have hit additional ones in the last 30 minutes since I last updated my talking points, leaving lawmakers scrambling to come up with a plan that can pass both the House and the Senate and will be signed by the President. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But today, NACO wanted to provide you with an overview of the federal policy landscape as it pertains to counties, both where we ended up last year and then what we anticipate coming down the pipeline for this year. So as a quick recap, we started the year with a new president and a new 115th Congress, and it's been interesting, to say the least, to watch the ongoing political dynamics. There has been a lot of analysis and commentary about the decreased productivity of Congress, and that's somewhat true when you look at the historical trends. Of the 7,700 bills introduced so far this Congress, only 82 have been signed into law, making it so far one of the least productive when it comes to total number of bills introduced and signed. That said, some of the bills that have been passed are certainly more substantive than bills that have been passed in the first year of past Congresses, and we certainly have to think about the tax reform bill when we talk about these discussions. And we are going to continue to see a lot more changes in Congress. There are currently 54 lawmakers in the House and Senate combined who have already announced retirement, resigned, or have left to pursue other political positions, including 5 in the Senate and 49 in the House. Now that we've moved into 2018, the midterm elections are also on everyone's minds and are about 10 months away. So every vote that Congress makes is going to count, and there's going to be a focus on what impact it could have on the midterm outcome. Just very quickly, in the Senate, there are 33 seats up for re-election, with Democrats defending 25 of them, including their 2 independent seats, and Republicans defending 8. Those 25 that Democrats are defending include 10 senators in states that the president won in 2016. In the House, Democrats would need to gain 24 seats to take over the majority if we expect to see some kind of wave towards the Democrats in the next election. So when we take a look at the policy environment facing counties at the federal level, we've started to see and understand that it is similar to what many of you may have been facing with some of your state legislatures when it comes to preemption, more mandates, less money, things like that. We are now feeling a similar squeeze from the federal government. We saw it through last year's major attempts at healthcare reform, through some pieces of the completed tax reform efforts, and we are already anticipating for this year comprehensive entitlement reform and potential cuts to discretionary spending. We'll discuss some of those things more in a little bit. The first place that I would like to start is the regulatory environment under both the Trump administration and Congress, which has generally been positive for counties. We track a lot of and spreadsheets and lists of them, and I would be happy to share those with anyone listening in or who listens to this webinar later and would like to look at them. I will just highlight a couple of the big ones that have moved in the last year in a positive direction for counties. The administration halted the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers Water of the U.S. rule, or WOTUS, as we refer to it, and they're working to rewrite the rule right now. NACO is actively engaged in that process and hopes that the new rule will take into account the extensive role in county infrastructure. As some of you may recall, 2 years ago, the Department of Labor put out an overtime rule that would have doubled the salary threshold for certain exempt employees, which could have potentially had a big impact on counties as we employ over 3.6 million people across the country. The rule had gone to the court process, and the Trump administration is no longer defending the previous administration's position. So in essence, the rule is dead, although the department may consider a new rule under the new administration. Another regulatory victory for counties was the president signing into law a bill that stopped the Bureau of Land Management's planning rule that would very much have harmed the land consultation process for our public lands counties. Another place that we're excited about potential changes is the FEMA quote-unquote disaster deductible proposal, where they would have looked to shift federal disaster spending costs downward to states and local governments, asking them to meet a certain deductible before any federal public assistance was available. At this point, we've heard rumors and whispers that proposal may be dead, and we continue to work with FEMA to find a new way to build cost-effective solutions to recovering from disasters. Finally, they continue working towards reducing regulations around building and maintenance of infrastructure and better coordination around the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA. Again, many positive steps for counties on the regulatory front, although we are still working with EPA, who is moving forward to implement the more stringent ozone air quality standards and coordinating with states to determine which counties do not meet these new standards. So now I'll jump into the big ticket item from last year, which was tax reform. After what felt like a setback on healthcare earlier in the year, the administration and congressional leadership really focused their attention on tax reform as their top priority towards the end of last year. As a reminder, the last comprehensive tax reform proposal was passed under President Reagan in 1986. The House went first with their bill and passed it with all Democrats and 13 Republicans voting against the measure, and after a few back and forths between the two chambers, ultimately the Senate passed a final version a few weeks later on a 51-48 vote, as Senator John McCain was ill and unable to vote. And after much back and forth, the president signed the bill into law on December 23rd. Now, you may recall that they did this tax reform through a process that allowed them to only need a simple majority in the Senate instead of the normal 60 votes. So how did counties fare in this process? Well, one of our top priorities, the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds, which certainly have been under threat of a cap or elimination over the past few years, were held harmless. That tax exemption remains, and we consider that a major win in the tax reform bill. Unfortunately, another financing mechanism called advance refunding bonds were eliminated. These are also tax exempt under previous law. These were tax exempt bonds as well, and counties could use advance refunding bonds to refinance their previously issued tax exempt municipal bonds at a lower interest rate to save taxpayer money on outstanding debt. You can think of this as similar to refinancing a mortgage on your home. Under current law, counties can issue, under past law, counties can issue one advance refunding per municipal bond, and these refundings saved local taxpayers $12 billion from 2012 to 2016 across the country. In fact, $417 million of those savings came from Illinois alone, as municipalities in the state issued almost $14 billion in advance refunding bonds over that time frame. Advance refunding bonds generally for the last decade have been about 1/3 of the total municipal bond marketplace. The elimination of these bonds will generate roughly $17 billion in new revenue for the federal government over the next 10 years. Another issue that we were closely watching is private activity bonds. The final bill did preserve private activity bonds, something that we were not initially expecting to be under attack, given the administration and Congress's deep interest in facilitating public-private partnerships and infrastructure. And so being able to preserve private activity bonds can be considered a big win, especially for medium to large counties where they are most commonly used. Finally, you've probably heard a lot about the state and local tax deduction, or SALT, at this point. For those who haven't, SALT is, or at least was, the most widely claimed deduction, with over 44 million people taking it in the last fiscal year that we have information available. When you pay your federal taxes each year, you can choose to take the standard deduction, or you can itemize and deduct your property sales and income taxes. So in essence, you don't get taxed on these items twice. So why did we work on this issue from a county perspective? Well, first and foremost, the SALT deduction dates back to 1862 and was included in the original federal code in 1913. It was actually created by the conservatives of the day to protect against the federal government overwhelming local tax systems, so essentially to protect state and local control. Second, we worked pretty closely with some of the housing and building groups here in Washington, the realtors and the home builders, and they projected that home ownership could take a hit, as could current home values. And for counties who often have their main source of revenue as property taxes, a hit to home values would certainly hit the revenues coming into local governments. And third, an elimination of the SALT deduction would really tighten the overall ability of local communities to invest in essential public services and have flexibility in generating revenue and meeting their budgets. So why was SALT targeted? Well, when you look at the past federal tax code, SALT was one of the top 10 expenditures. It was worth about $1.3 trillion overall. It was a big revenue raiser, and initially Congress wanted to eliminate SALT altogether. We can also thank some of our think tank friends for another perspective on why SALT should be eliminated, which was that local governments are not responsible with their revenue. If you're interested, we're happy to share some of their reports with you, but basically they made statements like, for states who tax and spend and do not balance their own budgets, the elimination of SALT will force them to get their fiscal houses in order. Or the SALT deduction encourages big spenders at the state level to mask the severity of their fiscal malfeasance. Or, and perhaps the most harmful one for county governments, indeed, without the SALT deduction, citizens are more likely to hold their local elected officials responsible for government mismanagement. So all that said, what did the final bill do with SALT? It actually retained in structure, for the most part, the SALT deduction up to a capped amount of $10,000. So an individual can deduct their property taxes, and then they may choose between either income or sales taxes, as for the most part, that's how the deduction worked in the past. You could choose your state income or your state sales tax to deduct. Keep in mind, again, initial proposals would have eliminated the deduction entirely. So we consider this a win for counties. Congress accepted the principle behind the deduction, accepted the principle of local control, and now our goal will be to have that capped threshold expanded. In the House, we ended up with 11 Republicans, largely from New York, New Jersey, and California, who sort of were firmly on the side of retaining salt, but ultimately the bill was too big and too important to be held up over this one issue. So it did pass, and we've walked through all the changes, and we expect there will be a technical corrections bill sometime in 2018, in which NACO will work to advocate for restoring the advanced refunding bonds we talked about earlier, and raising that cap or ditching the cap on the state and local tax deduction. Up next for this year is federal spending for fiscal year 2018. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is a moving target right now, and there are lots of conversations going on. So we'll walk through sort of where we are right now and maybe what a sticking point or two is. But please don't hold me to this if you read a different news report 2 hours from now. But as if all the big issues weren't difficult enough to tackle, the federal government almost ran out of money right before Christmas, and now they're running up against a new deadline, which is actually tomorrow. So if Congress fails to reach an agreement on government funding by midnight tomorrow, the federal government will shut down. So what are the sticking points right now? There are two fairly big ones. One is immigration and what to do with the so-called DACA or Dreamers, individuals who came here as children and have grown up here. And on the healthcare side, there are a few different healthcare pieces, but the big one is the Children's Health Insurance Program, which needs reauthorizing. Generally, when it comes to government funding, NACO advocates for sustained government funding so that local governments can plan their budgets accordingly. We know that most local governments have to do at least an annual budget, if not a budget every 2 years. So knowing how much money from the federal government is going to be coming in or not coming in is very important. In this case, we also have an additional priority caught in the crosshairs of the government funding decisions, which is the so-called Cadillac Tax. The Cadillac Tax is a 40% excise tax on high-value health plans, which was instituted under the Affordable Care Act. Right now, there is overwhelming bipartisan support for repealing or delaying this tax. And this, again, is a big deal for counties because often counties may not be able to meet the demand in the private marketplace for salaries and things like that. But one place that we often can is through health benefits and good health packages. And if high-value health plans were suddenly taxed at a higher rate, that would make it much more difficult for counties to recruit and retain quality workforces. Current efforts on this issue have attached a further delay of the Cadillac tax to 2022. It's actually successfully attached right now to the government funding mechanism that they're talking about passing. However, there is some debate over whether or not these health pieces should be attached, should be passed. Just this morning, the president appeared to call for the health pieces to be done separately. Since then, there has been some clarification that they want the health pieces done permanently, not necessarily separately. So we're hopeful Congress will both fund the government and further implement this delay. Tied to the discussion about the fiscal year 2018 spending package are some of our public lands issues, which may or may not be some of the most important issues for your county. The big one is the payment in lieu of taxes program, in which the federal government reimburses counties at a rate of cents on the dollar for federal land within a county's jurisdiction that the county therefore cannot charge property taxes on, but still has to provide services like emergency management, solid waste removal, infrastructure, and things like that. The payment in lieu of taxes, or PILT program, was fully funded for 2017. But we are still working to get full funding for 2018. You can see on the map on the left here that counties all across the country get PILT money. It is obviously most heavily concentrated in the West, but certainly not exclusively. We're also working with a program called the Secure Rural Schools Program, or SRS, to get that reauthorized for forest and timber counties. And that was a program that was generated to, again, reimburse especially western counties you can see there, who are reliant on timber revenues for some of the changes to what was allowed in the logging and mining industry. And we're working with our congressional champions to get a 2-year reauthorization attached to the spending package as well. Moving a little bit away from the spending package, although not too far, we also, a big county priority is the National Flood Insurance Program, and Congress still needs to act on this. Last year, the House passed a bill to reauthorize the program through 2022, but the Senate has not yet acted, and I say not too far away from the government funding question, because the last 2 government funding bills included short extensions of the NFIP program to keep that running while the longer-term reauthorization is worked through. So it's another issue that's hanging out there, and again, we would like to see a long-term reauthorization so that counties and individuals across the country can have certainty when it comes to this program. So in addition to those pieces, let's take a quick look at other things we anticipate for this year. We are basically trying to predict the unpredictable here, but we'll do our best. And of course, as issues come up and die down in Congress, NACO does our best to work with our leadership and again, through that policy process to make sure that we are weighing in on things that matter to counties across the country. We're also going to move on to the cartoon portion of the slides, which hopefully will make this slightly more entertaining. So in addition to circling back to healthcare at some point, the administration remains focused on an infrastructure package. At this point, there aren't many more details than what we knew at the end of last year. We do hear rumblings that a sort of more fleshed out infrastructure guidelines and package, although not legislative text, will be introduced from the administration and from the White House shortly following the State of the Union address. The White House still hopes to move a 10-year trillion-dollar package with up to $200 billion of that in real dollars, and they hope to include private sector incentives, tax credits, innovative financing, public-private partnerships, project and environmental streamlining, and other potential funding things for other pieces to make up that other $800 billion of the $1 trillion. Of note for counties, they may not count debt financing or bonds when they go to consider how much revenue a specific county or state or municipality can bring to the table. There may be a portion of the package that is, we will give you money if you can meet it, and that may or may not include bonds or other debt financing mechanisms. So we are closely watching that, and we know how hard it is and how many counties across the country are already under restrictions from their state governments and other municipalities about how much they can raise or lower revenue in any given year. So we continue to work with the administration to talk about that. The administration has also touted a streamlining of NEPA, again, with some of the environmental reviews and other regulatory reforms to quicken infrastructure projects. They put out numbers that said if you quicken infrastructure projects by many years, it could save up to $3.6 trillion in delays and red tape. They've never explicitly said how they reached that 3.6 trillion number, but certainly would be a boon to counties if they were able to push that through. While the administration, as I said, seems to acknowledge some of the county role in infrastructure ownership, maintenance, and development, again, counties across the country generally own 45% of roads, 40% of bridges, etc. The administration also seems to regularly push the message that states and locals need to get out of the way of private sector delivery of infrastructure and to raise more money on our own. We've communicated with them that some of the changes we see and could have seen in tax reform would have been detrimental to future infrastructure packages. Some of those changes, like advanced funding bonds, are going to be somewhat detrimental to local governments. So we continue to press them on ensuring that local governments have the financing means necessary to have every tool in the toolbox available to update and build our infrastructure across the country. The question, of course, is how quickly will they be able to work on a package this year, and where will they find the funding? Again, we've heard the administration's proposal is around 70 pages and that it could be released any week now. So more to come on that front. NACO's certainly involved with the administration and Congress on a daily basis on the infrastructure issues. We could also see attempts this year at major entitlement and welfare reform, although I do want to preface this with the caveat that nobody really seems to want to go first, even though everyone knows that some of these programs are significant drivers of our national debt. And it's pretty unclear if the administration and the Senate and the House are all on the same page. So I mentioned earlier the tax reform bill that is actually scored to add a little over $1.5 trillion to our national debt, some of which is expected to be made up through economic growth. But Speaker Paul Ryan in the House said that entitlement reform could be how they reduce federal government spending if they need to meet that gap. Specifically, he said, we're going to have to get back next year, meaning 2018, and look at entitlement reform, which is how you tackle the debt and deficit. So we definitely take that as an indicator of his interest, of interest in the House, of taking this on. This effort could include everything from health programs like Medicare and Medicaid to other social safety net programs, including the TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is the federal cash assistance program for low-income families with children, or the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as the Food Stamps Program, which offers nutrition assistance to low-income individuals and families. Speaker Ryan put out a plan in 2016 called A Better Way, which looked at a lot of the different poverty programs the federal government operates. And we take that as an initial guide for the potential entitlement efforts, especially because it also served as the initial guide for the tax reform efforts. There are things in that plan that include things like increasing work requirements, increasing the role of state and local governments in administering benefits, and setting up a commission for evidence-based policymaking to ensure programs are producing positive results. All of that said, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he doesn't want to do entitlement reform this year, and as I mentioned earlier, everything has an eye towards the election, and if there's one thing that's unpopular across both party lines, it's going after Medicare and Medicaid in an election year. So regardless, NACO is working to tighten our messaging around what counties do in these areas, what the county role is in these programs, and how we not just protect the status quo, but offer good policy recommendations to improve the programs and outcomes for individuals and families at the local level. Somewhat tied to that conversation is the Farm Bill, which comes up every 5 or 6 years. And the Farm Bill does need to be reauthorized in 2018. And we'll surely see hot negotiations, both because it's always a big driver in Washington, and also because the SNAP nutrition program that we talked about is usually a part of the Farm Bill or attached to it. Just as by way of reference, in last year, 41.3 million people were enrolled in the SNAP program, which is down from a high of 47 million in 2013 as enrollments climbed following the Great Recession. There are many other items NACO and counties care about in the Farm Bill, especially under the Rural Development title, like rural water, wastewater, and broadband access. The Farm Bill also reauthorizes policy for farm income support, crop insurance, conservation, and again, those nutrition policies. NACO is engaged on all of these fronts. We certainly have an eye towards any larger budget cuts that could threaten some of these rural development programs or other direct grants to counties, as they already make up a very small percentage of the pie of federal spending, and any cuts to them would greatly diminish that assistance to local governments. Moving on to just a couple final things before we wrap up. I think I have 3 left. The debt ceiling remains an outstanding issue. No one in DC really wants to not raise the debt ceiling, but there is certainly a question about who has the leverage and what will be tied to it, and the administration is urging the debt ceiling to be lifted. There are a few lawmakers who oppose it, but generally it's just a question of when and how and what else gets tied to it that could drag it down. One other piece that I really want to stress on that NACO is focusing on is the opioid crisis. This has been a big focus of NACO's for the last 4 or 5 years, as this issue has really taken a toll in a lot of places across the country. At the end of last year, President Trump established a federal task force to address the opioid crisis. They recently released their list of 56 recommendations to combat the crisis. He also declared a national public health emergency to help expedite federal resources and improve coordination, although generally left the ball in Congress's court to provide additional federal funds. And NACO continues to focus many resources on this issue as well. Last year, we put out a new report called A Prescription to Action, which laid out a number of recommendations for state and local officials in combating the epidemic. And we continue to work with Congress and the administration to urge them to direct more resources to this issue. So again, really ongoing. We actually have a conference going on right now in Shelby County, Tennessee, which is Memphis, which is actually highlighting this issue. So many conversations about this going on. Finally, the last issue I want to bring up is remote and online sales taxes. The Supreme Court has finally agreed to hear a case that would open the door for states and counties to collect sales taxes on remote purchases, including those done over the internet. This would or could generate millions of dollars across the country for state and local governments. Some estimates put this total as high as $26 billion. The court is likely to hear arguments in April and then rule this summer. NACO is a big supporter of allowing state and local governments to collect these existing sales taxes on remote purchases. We've supported a bill called the Marketplace Fairness Act, which passed the Senate back in 2013, as well as a bill called the Remote Transactions Parity Act, which has been introduced in the House. Congress has multiple times tried to get this issue over the finish line, and they have come up short. There have been some blocks in the House, and we continue to work with Congress to try and overcome some of those stops. We would prefer a legislative fix because it could ensure a role for counties and a seat at the table and access to that revenue, whereas a court decision could just sort of open the floodgates and states would be left to regulate themselves, regulate each other, and it would be sort of a mixed bag. So we hope that the court taking up the case will encourage Congress to push this over the finish line, but at the very least it will sort of change the landscape and open a new opportunity. So I think I just covered about 36 different topics in 35 minutes or so, so I want to leave some time for questions. I do briefly want to circle back to what NACO refers to as our top legislative priorities. Each policy steering committee that I mentioned earlier selects their top 2 or 3 issues each year, and then NACO's board determines the top 6 to 8 issues across the organization that all of our staff, all of our members are sort of focused on. I know the font is small here, but our top 8 are listed here and cover many of the topics we discussed today: infrastructure, waters of the U.S., collecting existing sales taxes, some of the poverty issues, long-term farm bill, partnerships on Medicaid and health programs, PILT and SRS, and then some of the substance abuse issues as well. So, of course, this document is not a catch-all. In my day-to-day role, I focus on everything from pensions to tax changes to the census to elections to county and tribal issues. So the legislative priorities in front of you are not all that we cover, but they do sort of help give a snapshot of what our members have raised up as some of the top issues across the country. So all of that said, our staff is always here to answer any questions or get you more information on nearly any domestic policy issue. And I want to thank the University of Illinois Extension again for this partnership. And with that, we're going to turn to question time. I am going to look to the chat. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat space. And I will just go on the couple of ones that we've gotten so far. So the first is any insights regarding the likelihood of success of counties and states which are asking pharmaceutical firms to pay for damages related to use and overuse of opioids. This is a great question. It is actually something that we've heard from our members quite a bit, and it's sort of become so much of a hot topic that NACO at our upcoming legislative conference is actually hosting a workshop solely dedicated to how counties can be successful in these suits, I guess, against pharmaceutical firms. Off the top of my head, I don't have our sort of boilerplate or language on sort of best practices available. NACO's legislative conference, if I haven't mentioned it, is March 3rd through 7th here in Washington, and that workshop will certainly be recorded and made available on our website afterwards. So we'd be happy to share that information with the University of Illinois Extension, and they can disseminate it as well. And also my contact information is there on the screen, and I'd be happy to be in touch directly as well to disseminate that information when it is available. Second, as other folks think of questions or type them in if they have them, there are many ways to engage with NACO. I've talked just about the policy process. We have over 1,200 different elected officials serving on, elected officials and staff, I should say, serving on our 10 policy steering committees. But we have a Veterans and Military Services Committee. We have an Arts and Culture Commission. We have a Programs Committee. We have anywhere from 60 to 80 workshops at each of our conferences. We put on what seems like and often is weekly webinars on different issues facing counties. That you can log onto our website and sort of scroll through all of this. I would encourage each of you, if you're interested in becoming more acquainted with NACO, to check first and see if your county is a member. If you are, there are many benefits that your county gets and can access and can share with your residents just by being a member of NACO. And perhaps the best way to engage is to join us at one of our conferences. We, as I said, our legislative conference, which is in DC every year, will be March 3rd through 7th this year. Great opportunity to do some of the committees, to do some of the workshops, but also a great opportunity. We schedule it specifically when Congress is in town so that we can schedule Hill meetings, so that your state associations can schedule Hill meetings. So really a good opportunity there. And I will put in a plug for our annual conference this summer, which I believe is July 12th through the 16th. And it is going to be in Davidson County, which is a joint city county, and that's in Nashville, Tennessee. So a great location there. Should be a great event. It's actually going to be at the Grand Ole Opry, so there will be great programming as well as great opportunity to be in Nashville and experience that. So many different ways to get involved. Feel free to reach out to me directly. We have a full membership team who is happy to walk through all of these things as well. And we like to say, if you're ever in Washington, our office is your office. We work for county elected officials and their staffs all across the country. So if you're in town and need a place to grab coffee or put your bag down or even rest and work for a couple hours, we're here, and please don't hesitate to stop by. At this point, I will pause. Happy to take any other questions or answer anything else. But again, I'm available and our whole staff is available. And I do want to thank Kathy and the University of Illinois Extension again for the invitation.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for the excellent program today. We will be sending out the slide deck, and I think you've provided us a lot of great information on how to stay connected with NACO. And in particular, I felt like the slide that talked about your legislative priorities is one that we want to stay close to and stay connected with the work that you're doing. Today's program is being recorded, and we will let you know where you can share that recording with other members of your board or organization, and that'll be a part of an email message. Nancy Orduego has a poll that she would like, we'd like to get your feedback here today on today's program in terms of information and content that was provided. And in the meantime, if you do have questions, please do reach out to your local University of Illinois Extension office, and they can help you in getting connected with our local government education committee and direct you to the website that has the catalog of previous programs that you may find others of interest. So thank you for participating today, and please do feel free to contact us at any time. Thank you, Jack. A great program.
Thank you, Kathy.
So Anne's asking for a link to the legislative priorities graphics. When in that slide deck, Anne, I think there was a link at the top of that. So we'll make sure that we get that. And I was thinking that might be a good thing to add to our local government website. Anything else? Oh. Anna answered her own question. That's great.
Yeah, I will just jump on and thank Anne for finding that PDF so quickly to the entire report. We do our entire American Counties platform, which is every policy stance on every issue that NACO has, is also online. If you go to that naco.org/advocacy, which I can type in here, it's a little over 100 pages, so it's not going to be the most exciting read, but if you're curious if NACO has policy on any specific issue, you can pull that up, and it's broken down by committee and is searchable by word as well. So would recommend that folks check that out if they want to.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's a great way to weigh in on those issues. Looks like we've shut down, Jack. If you want to go on to the next activity in DC, we really appreciate, again, you taking time to join us.
Sounds great. Thank you all again. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.